Dear participants, it's with immense joy and gratitude that I stand here today as we gather for the 25th Humanitarian Congress Berlin in person. After enduring several years of online events, it is a pleasure to see so many of you coming together physically. Welcome. Welcome as well to all those participating online. Before we embark on 2 days of profound exchange, learning, listening, and hopefully passionate debates, just some small housekeeping announcements. Right now, we are in the Münzenberg room. This stage is live-streamed for online audiences and has subtitles in French and Spanish. If you attend in person, you will be able to ask questions after each session here in the room, simply raising your hand, and you will get a microphone. Our online participants can use the Zoom Q&A. We have lots of breaks, and during these breaks, you have the time to get to know each other and discuss. However, we ask you to please always be on time so we can start the session in time. From 11 a.m. onward, we will have sessions running in parallel. To attend the panels in the room called Salon, stay on the first floor and just go down the corridor to the end. You can find the full program on your name badge or via QR code. The venue Wi-Fi is open and free and is called Conference. The theme for this year's Congress, Out of Sight, Out of Mind. Unveiling attention and neglect in humanitarian action and global health is spot on. At the 25th Humanitarian Congress, we will be discussing the structures behind attention and neglect, the role of neglect and attention in humanitarian action, in global health, for how media report about crisis or not. We will discuss questions why some crises and conflicts receive attention, media coverage, and funding, while others are practically ignored. Or why healthcare needs of women been neglected for centuries and continue to be in many places and ways. What effects do political reforms have on people in need, as well as on humanitarian actors like Doctors Without Borders? How do these policies contribute to neglect and exclusion? And most importantly, how can we, as humanitarian actors, change and influence these patterns? Preparing for this event, you can't avoid to realize the concept that lies at the heart of neglect and attention: power. Let me illustrate this with 3 examples. Firstly, as a gynecologist, I'm witnessing how gender equality is connected to power. In many places of the world, women are still not given the right and power to decide on their own body, on their health, or seeking for support when they feel the need. During crisis, be it natural disasters or conflicts, women's health is the first to be neglected, while at the same time, numbers of sexual and gender-based violence are increasing. The situation in Afghanistan for women is an extreme we see today. Unfortunately, not the only place where women are deprived of power and rights. Secondly, as humanitarian actors, we are actually aware of how policies can lead to neglect and worsen the plight of those facing crisis. Those policies, of course, are intrinsically based on power. while in big camps like Cox's Bazar, Dadaab, or now in Chad and many other places, the needs for people on the move are not met, the numbers are rising, and the crises are not seen on our screens, one of the richest places in the world agreed last week on an alarming reform: the Common European Asylum System. This new agreement represents a grave political disregard for the sanctity of human lives. Across our projects in Greece, Poland, Lithuania, Libya, and the central Mediterranean Sea, we have witnessed European states capitalizing on the idea of extraordinary measures to lower safeguards for those in dire need. These measures have in turn facilitated violent practices such as border pushbacks and prolonged arbitrary detention. We have first-hand knowledge that these measures restrict independent humanitarian aid and civil society monitoring, making assistance to those in need increasingly challenging. It is a grim testament to the engineering of neglect manifested in policies. Thirdly, we must confront how power dynamics are responsible for deadly neglect in global health. Health needs affecting millions of people are deprioritized and neglected merely because they are not seen as profitable market. We do not have an effective TB vaccine on the market, a disease that kills 1.6 million, mostly poor people each year, simply because pharmaceutical companies couldn't see enough profit. We see spikes on cholera and diphtheria outbreaks, as vaccination campaigns were put on hold while the world turned its attention on COVID-19 and continues to sorely focus on pandemic preparedness. Power is the common narrative weaving through these examples of neglect. It is both the cause of neglect and the key to addressing it. I'm heartened to see this room filled with people keenly interested in understanding the power dynamics that perpetuate neglect, recognizing the pivotal role of attention in humanitarian responses, and committed to discovering new tools and strategies to thrust neglected crises back into the spotlight. Yet, let us not forget that we too are not immune to the structural patterns that lead to neglect. As MSF and many other humanitarian organizations, we have had and still have our own reckoning in tackling power imbalance, institutional exclusions, discrimination, and racism within our organization. We still have a long way to go, and we want to invite this Congress to be a safe space for self-reflection and institutional change. In the face of daunting challenges posed by the climate crisis and dwindling interest and funding for humanitarian aid, we must become even quicker and more adaptable in our examination of power dynamics. Only then we can try to break the vicious cycle where attention and neglect become the drivers of change. Thank you all for your dedication, your compassion, and your commitment to humanitarian action and global health. Let us, at the 25th Humanitarian Congress Berlin, rise to the challenge before us and work collectively to bring about the change we see. Welcome to the 25th Humanitarian Congress. I am now delighted to hand over to the chair of our opening keynote session, Dr. Glenda Cooper, is the Deputy Head of the Journalism Department and BA Program Director of City University of London. She is the author of Reporting Humanitarian Disasters in a Social Media Age and co-editor of Humanitarianism, Communications and Change. Dr. Cooper.
Thank you, and it's my great pleasure to be here chairing this keynote session on Day One, and actually to be here at the Humanitarian Congress in Berlin. After that sort of nice introduction, basically I'm here as a researcher to learn so much. Because as we know, humanitarian stories can be in the spotlight, as we've seen in recent days, but all too often out of sight, out of mind. The relationship between media coverage and humanitarian response, journalists and humanitarians, is, as we all know, frequently a tricky one. Why do some crises get attention? Why are some others left unnoticed? How are framings of disasters reinforced? And who are the other stakeholders who play an important part? Well, we're lucky enough to have two distinguished speakers this morning who can shed light from their own experience on how norms and practices may be changing, what limits there are for journalists, and what role humanitarians can play in bringing neglected issues to light. And as we've just heard, power is always part of the common narrative there. But just before I introduce them, some housekeeping. Please do join this in this debate online using the hashtag HCBerlin. Online participants, hello. You're also very welcome to comment and post questions in the Zoom Q&A window. And on the live stream, there is also live captioning. The link will be sent in this chat by the support team, and there will be online live translation into French and Spanish. So with those details dealt with, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who's a long-standing voice in fact-based international journalism and is recognised for her coverage of flight, asylum and migration. Isabel Schayani is an experienced journalist with the German Public Broadcasting Institution. She heads WDR4U, which is a news platform for refugees and newly arrived people in Germany. She's also covered the war in Ukraine. And in 2021, she received the Grimme Special Award for her reports from the Greek refugee camp Meyer. Isabel Schayani.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you, dear participants, for being here. When you fall in love, your hearts beat very loud and fast, your mind is rather quiet, and this is normally how things start. Everything is new, everything is exciting. One could call it the romantic phase. It seems to be the law of nature that after this first romantic phase, the next phase follows, and you realize he never washes dishes, each one of his socks has a hole, and the mother calls way too much. And you get you get annoyed, and now the important word is you get used to it. So this second phase has started, and one could say these phases, the romantic start first, and then the adjustment phase also occur, at least this is my observation, this is no scientific background or anything, just my experience. So these two phases also occurred in the world of interest. So let me apply my actually very simplistic love phase theory to news. First, of course, we are shocked, for example, by what we just witnessed or hear happens in Palestine and Israel. We are overwhelmed by what we hear from Afghanistan. We are silently and deeply touched when we heard what was going on in Iran, and Ukraine, of course, kept our minds and hearts busy for quite a while. So this definitely is the romantic phase of news. And then, so after staring at people rushing to the Kabul airport, after watching almost live how courageous young women in Iran would uncover their hair and risk their physical well-being, after also in Germany opening doors, and in Germany and in Europe opening doors to the Ukrainian, – so our life went back to normal. and we get used to it. For example, while watching news on television about the Taliban and how they would ban girls from schools, we probably, many of us, perhaps start to also check Instagram simultaneously. But now there is not only one love, and we do not only have one crisis in the world, and still we journalists, of course, try to get most attention for our own report, because the coverage of the crisis I'm doing right now, of course, for me as a journalist, is always, at this moment, a very important one. And people get irritated, and they say, which one should I focus first on? I already focused on 3, Israel, Ukraine, Afghanistan, and now you want me to immerse myself into Yemen, Eritrea, into climate change, and the Rohingya in Bangladesh. So the law of nature, my simplistic law of nature, romantic phase first, and then the adjustment phase, and then maybe is being followed by a phase of being fatigue. And we spread thin. So let me describe 4 thoughts from my experience why decisions from journalists for certain topics are being taken the way they are. They are not scientific. I'm not a scientist. They're probably very simple, but this is how I experience this. So the first point is, if it was just one crisis that would catch our attention, it would be way easier. But we are confronted with a media world where it seems that everything is screaming at me, look at me, hey, you obese, value-oriented Westerner, we need your attention and your empathy and probably also your support. Scientists, as I learned when I was preparing myself for this speech, call it finite pool of worries. I don't know if you've heard of it, maybe it's very familiar to you, for me it was new. It means that humans have finite emotional resources, and also viewers and listeners and readers have a finite use for a finite emotional resource. So when we become more worried about one threat, it means a decrease of worry about the other ones. I guess you humanitarians are dealing with this all the time, I don't know. So we can watch a crisis, we can watch a conflict almost in real time, and this might be fascinating and thrilling at the beginning. But then after a certain time, it depends on the crisis and the nearness of the crisis, this fascination vanishes and we are kind of saturated. And also, these crises are not, they used to be much further away, somewhere down in some other strange continent, and now they seem to come closer, they affect our own lives. And of course, this also affects our fatigue and our thinking and also our fear. So this is the first point. The second point is, you also might be familiar with this, I guess so, polycrisis. You have many crises at the same time. One might say, great, for you as a journalist, it's not boring at all. Yes, but being reflecting and also being confronted with these different crises causes the feeling that, okay, what solution do we have? Plus, we have a high speed. You have the feeling that one crisis follows the next one, and you are always in this breaking news mode, and it seems that this breaking news mode seems to be the new normal, and this is how I feel about this constantly being in a state of polycrisis, and this has effects on viewers, listeners, on readers. People are less interested in news, although we have more crises, so the development is right into the other direction. In 2013, just to give you 2 numbers, in 2013 it was 80% that were regularly interested in news, according to Reuters' digital news report. In 2023, from 80, it decreased to 52. This is quite a lot, I find. And then people say that they're trying to avoid news, especially issues like Ukraine and promi news. Those are the 2 categories that was interesting for me. And then, this is something that I find encouraging, 58% are interested in positive news, which offers solutions. And this is something we as journalists are not used to. Our way of thinking, our mindset is more or less that if you have a positive story, it tends to be more boring. Now we see a change and a shift in thought here, but still this is how we are sort of socialized. So Now coming to my third point is all these points, danke, create a feeling of uncertainty. Uncertainty, especially amongst us, that we produce news. Because it's not only this too much and fatigue and polycrisis, this insecurity also means that my media could be affected because, for example, the network I work for, I don't know how long we will persist in this political situation. So we used to be very self-confident. Now this has vanished, kind of, because we don't know what is going to be next. I think this also applies to other big institutions. And this uncertainty also affects our work and our way of deciding. So it seems that our view that used to be a bit more world-embracing is now more national, could be more local, and is more limited one, because fear also affects us, and because we see that public discourse is very divided, and people keep asking us, which side are you on? So I'm describing this to give you an understanding of this feeling of uncertainty, insecurity, undecidedness, Unsicherheit. That's the precise German word, right? I don't really have an English equivalent. Unsicherheit is the precise word for it. This is the third point, and I have 4 more minutes. And the fourth point, from my point of view, is also when you choose news or what affects our mindsets as journalists is how does it affect us? So my colleague, I was discussing with my Syrian colleague just yesterday, said, of course it makes a difference if something happens in Ukraine or if something happens in Bangladesh. And I said, why? But they're humans. And then he says, yes, but Arab countries also prefer to not report about Colombia because it doesn't really affect them. And then you might say, okay, fine, but what about human rights standards? Do you journalists have a collective stiff neck, that's the word. So as a result, I could say that our interests or our decisions for conflicts and crises are geographically more limited. So we are not constantly looking at South Sudan, and you will say, oh, but this is your job, this is what we pay you for. We are not constantly looking at Somalia. We don't have the Rohingya in the world's largest camps in Bangladesh on mind. We obviously seem to have a collective stiff neck, yes, but I'm trying to explain or to describe that we are part of this society. Society is on the move right now, and of course it affects our mindsets. Everything else, I think, would be a lie. So what do we do? Now, the network I work for, ARD or WDR, is a part of this, has correspondents all around the world, and they offer their stories, and they research, and they have contacts all the time, and they're at the spot, and I hope many of you have met us somewhere around the world. But of course, the people who choose the stories are here in Germany, and they are the goalkeepers. They say yes or no. And then suddenly you have this whole bunch of criteria which I was describing, too many, being fatigue, Unsicherheit, polarization, plus does it affect us or not? And this is then how decisions are being taken. So what do I do, or what can I do? I can only tell you that during the last years, especially, I would say since 2016, as a journalist, I try to constantly readjust my compass, which seems to be more and more difficult, especially after the elections we had this weekend and after what is going on. And there is so much activism all around us, and people always say, which side are you on? And I'm a journalist, I'm trying to readjust my compass, and my direction is definitely the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, the Geneva Convention, and the European Convention on Human Rights, although these are also under attack, and probably my religious belief. But it's difficult and it's necessary to readjust this compass, also while talking to my colleagues. Then I have to learn, and this is a mindset, I have to learn to identify and find constructive stories. We try to do this in our channel by sharing stories of people who came here and who made it. You can't constantly do this because not everybody is making it. A fair amount of people is not making it, but you should cover both. And then I should always try to keep in mind, this is something I address to myself, is that I say I have to keep in mind that journalists are no activists, though this might be difficult for you to also to accept or to to see. I hope that you will have, during these 2 days, that you will have many insights, encouragement, and the feeling of hope. During these conference, I hope that you feel your own compass is pointing towards the right direction, and I hope that you can recharge it or reorient it here while you are here, because for me, one thing is sure: fear is contagious, but hope as well. And this is why your work is so important.
Thank you so very much, Isabel, for that expert summary on the position that journalists find themselves in, and a lot of food for thought there about sort of directions, about, as you say, which way is the compass pointing. Isabel has told us, what it's like to be a journalist in these very difficult stories that we face. We now turn to our second keynote speaker, Ruona Meyer, and who comes with a slightly different aspect for us this morning. So Ruona is the manager of the Africa Initiative at the Solutions Journalism Network, which advises journalists, non-profits, and Africa-focused donor organizations. She's also currently completing her PhD, which looks at power dynamics within African intercontinental collaborative investigative journalism networks dedicated to diversity and equity in journalism. As well as that, she also engages in media development research and works as an investigative journalist covering social, political topics in West Africa, solutions journalism, and African investigative journalism. Ruona, welcome.
I have a presentation. Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. Thank you all. Thank you for the introduction, Dr. Cooper. Thank you, Isabel, for the privilege of the stage. Thank you very much, Dr. Parvanta. Hallo zusammen. My Dutch is not so good. All protocols observed. Thank you all for the privilege to speak before you, distinguished audience. Our aim today is unveiling attention and neglect in humanitarian action and global health. To understand these twin factors, these forces of attention and neglect, we must begin with the fundamental reality that all human beings are in some way afflicted by crisis or inflicting crisis. Because of this, every one of us belongs to three groups. It's either you work as a humanitarian, you've received or will receive humanitarian assistance, and thirdly, you know somebody who is in groups 1 and 2. I'm in group 3 for now, because my first life lesson in nuance within the humanitarian sector came from a family member's experience. My father's cousin Toka was in his early 30s, working in a petrol station, or a gas station if you're American, when he left Nigeria. On some days, we speculated that he was in Europe, living a colorful life away from our hometown in southern Nigeria. But things changed in 1997, the same year that the Berlin Chamber of Physicians started what would later become this conference. By 1998, our family received a call. Uncle Toka was coming home in a wheelchair from Libya, where he had been stuck for 6 years. He had suffered a stroke because of beatings received in detention. That was a time and place where illegal migration was punishable by bribery, torture, even death. Humanitarian agencies fought for Toka and brought him home. Now, according to him, they didn't serve him food with glass plates on his flight back. But our family got the privilege to see Toka reach middle age and bury him. Toka and his stories from Libya opened my eyes to the humanitarian sector. In 2002, my journalism career began. That's the same year that the first edition of this conference was held. I've reported on migration, organized crime. I've managed newsroom grants, and I currently advise a UK-based team researching sexual exploitation of children by aid workers. In the 2 decades I've been working, mainly as a journalist, but also in the donor sector, what I've learned is this. Humanitarian attention to crisis remains shaped by colonialism. Newsrooms' attention to crisis remains shaped by media funding dynamics. And our audience's attention to crisis is largely defined by the proliferation and modification of social media platforms. So for us to make progress against neglect, humanitarians must wean their agencies off neocolonial inequity. They must adjust to their audiences and deploy nuance in airing both success and failures. I will now cover how these factors connect with attention to crisis, and of course, I'll suggest some solutions. We are not here for doom. The first factor is the remnants, the vestiges of colonialism that remain within humanitarian work. I'm sure we can all agree that the humanitarian sector needs to be racially decolonized and gender-wise reorganized. I will not spend time pointing out the racial complexion of the majority in this room. That is obvious for all to see. Rather, I want to speak to the compassion I believe exists in this room. Away from what divides us, let me now focus on what unites us here today, which is understanding what lies at the root of neglected or underreported crisis. Colonialism still determines what crisis locations receive the most attention, what is funded, where it is funded, and how quickly it is funded. It's often based on 3 things: whether the country was a former colony of the funder, whether the country is currently resource-rich, and whether the country is physically or diasporically close enough such that a crisis spilling over will be more expensive to manage. In this case, no matter what turns to some matter more. By the way, I think that's a very good slogan. A sector factor is donor priorities. Donors often exercise their legal right to attach their funding to themes that are more popular, or themes that guarantee maximum brand visibility. However, donor funding is also shaped to some extent by colonial affinities, because donors tend to align with government policies and priorities. Finally, colonial resonances remain with us based on a hierarchy of languages. Back then, colonizers chose which local languages would thrive by translating the Bible or civic information into specific languages, while other languages were intentionally starved. We see this today, right? In how certain languages are prioritized over others in the communication of crisis and communication during crisis. This delays or even erases attention, which fuels neglect. In this case, hashtag no matter where becomes no matter where, keep speaking big English. Speak it. Next is media funding dynamics. From our friends at the Norwegian Refugee Council, we know that the level of attention given to a crisis is not always the same as the size of the crisis. So aside from the funding of crisis based on forced colonial history and desired geopolitical futures, we see funding based on themes chosen by donors. For example, investigative journalism takes the lion's share of funding, and it takes about 34% of almost 11,000 grants worldwide from 2019 till today. But most of these grants do not come to media organizations in Africa and Asia, where various crises currently exist. Added to this is the reality that in these regions, the same media recipients are often the elite. They receive funding consistently, and journalism's reliance on funding that has thematic and duration restrictions is one reason why attention deficits exist and why attention to crisis is not sustained. Furthermore, humanitarians, you are directly implicated in reducing attention to crisis, because the tradition has always been to grant access to elite media organizations and elite journalists. It's usually said that humanitarian communication offices are never available to journalists, especially in Africa. I don't just speak out of turn, I'm a practicing journalist. Weeks can pass before you get a response to one email. In Germany, I've been asked to provide my press card or my national ID card before receiving information. This is still better than many African countries, where as journalists we're often totally ignored until the humanitarian agency has some international day to mark. And then they call a press conference with special invitations to the elite press. This information segregation disrupts crisis reporting because humanitarian agencies shift towards propaganda mode. It means they become known for only having something to say during appeals, during crisis onset, and during world days. Information segregation is a form of neocolonialism because it divides and separates for the exploitation of media resources at will. So every time a humanitarian ignores the legitimate press, then no matter who becomes, I matter more. The final driver of attention and neglect to crisis is social media platform proliferation and modification. Social media enables the public to change the narrative, gives them the chance to campaign against neglect during crisis. In fact, even traditionally closed-door humanitarian events are no longer private thanks to social media. This viral example is from the Fourth Late Chad Basin Governors Forum, which held in July. As you can see, there aren't a lot of people sitting in the hall. This event would have gone unnoticed until a Nigerian governor stood up, as you see, and challenged a UN representative for saying conflict in the region was worsening. This clip was watched over 70,000 times. The main challenge with social media is it doesn't often allow for context, and current modifications are reducing access to fact-based context, particularly news. More recently, X, is dropping headlines in stories, while Facebook no longer prioritizes news. Humanitarians, we therefore have an extra hurdle. As news leaves the most used social media platforms, so will fact-based attention to crisis. A final issue is that needs-based use of media by the public is resulting in more silos of communication, such as the community's function on X, closed groups on Facebook and WhatsApp, as well as subscription channels on Instagram. This means several rooms are opening, shutting off access for us all. Dear humanitarians, with the way things are going, I'm sure that hashtag no matter where is turning to can we be everywhere? Now we close with solutions. Permit me to say 3 things are crucial as you go into these meetings from today and discuss together. I know I might be taking some time, but I was under the impression I had more time. So permit me, because these issues are crucial. First of all, we must we must decolonize our communications mindset and frameworks. We must decolonize communications mindsets and frameworks. Second, we must diversify our formats to deliver in ways that align with the context and nuances of the media landscape and the audiences that are in our areas of implementation. And we must do so based on data. You will recall that just 0.2% of all humanitarian spending goes into humanitarian research and innovation. Finally, humanitarians, you need to work towards your future. We are in an existential crisis. We want a future where humanitarians remain trusted because they are relevant. The fastest way to achieve this is through actionable transparency, where openness and proactive accountability to the public is delivered through visible action and not reactionary press statements. So how do we start? Well, decolonization means the undoing of colonial legacies in creating ethnically and racially divided societies. Therefore, if you want to decolonize, reappraise your foundations, the root of your work, the various operational frameworks that may mean you could be unintentionally reinforcing colonialism. Ask yourselves, what is divisive in the crisis management, communication, monitoring, and evaluation value chain? What needs to change to increase inclusivity? Who needs to be here to achieve equity? Secondly, to diversify your formats for humanitarian service and your communication of that service. Start by deliberating. What does no matter what, no matter where, and no matter who mean for how we communicate about this crisis, how we communicate about which people, and for how long? What are the basic standards that are possible, given our limited human and monetary capital? Finally, to design your shared future with the stakeholders you serve, please remember this. The public is growing more sophisticated in their monitoring, whistleblowing, and commentary on humanitarians and the humanitarian sector. Therefore, so should you. Seek and achieve sophistication in your coordination and delivery of service. We are in a time where sophistication is not taking days to get back to journalists. The questions you should begin with are, where do the attention and information silos exist in our operations? Who and what are our weakest links? How are we resolving all these silos and weak links? How are we communicating our actions? And what actions are we communicating? To whom? I hope that these threads of thought inspire your deliberations and subsequent actions. I hope that long after this speech, when the trauma suffered by your team members and the pressures from the front line take their toll, I hope that you do not lose sight of why we are gathered here and in whose name and for whose cause we are gathered, the people. The need for you humanitarians and your humanitarian work remains greater than ever before. The numbers of displaced, the recent locations of disasters, conflicts, and crises teaches us that we may be humanitarians today, but beneficiaries tomorrow. Today, you are powerful. Today, you have the means to change the lives of the world's most vulnerable people. So please, do not let us down. As a word and as a profession, humanitarian means nothing if it doesn't start with the human. The human in you, the humans you work with, and the humans you work for. Therefore, adding meaning to the work you do is why we are all here, turning the spotlights on yourselves, seeking the wisdom of your peers, The next 2 days may be uncomfortable. The weeks after, even more uncomfortable. But remember, from meaningful conversations comes meaningful work. Therefore, congratulations to you all for prioritizing these meaningful conversations. I'm rooting for you. Thank you.
Hello? Is this on? Are these working? Can you hear me okay? Yeah, great. Thank you, and I want to say thank you very much, Ruona, for such an inspiring talk about where we are and where we should be. And I think both speakers have looked at the day-to-day problems, attention, crises, location, and also the longer-term problems that we face around decolonization, gender, and, as we've just heard, social media as well. And I think there's a challenge to us, as two journalists have put to us. These are the issues that they face. What are our responsibilities as humanitarians, and what are our responsibilities as media consumers as well? We're now in the questions phase. I'm going to actually chair's privilege and ask one question myself before throwing it open to the audience. And actually, Isabel, Ruona, what I want to ask you both is, what surprised you most in your speech from your fellow keynote speaker? So, Isabel, maybe first you, and then Ruona, you, if that's okay.
Well, I'm not too familiar with this kind of discourse, and with the thoughts that you are sharing. I guess people here on the floor, they are much more familiar with it. For me, it was most amazing that this colonization thought or reality that you are seeing is so big. I think that was the point that kept me busy all the time when I was listening to your really interesting and for me most striking was this point, and that kept me busy all the time.
I mean, I am a descendant of colonialism and happen to be living and unfortunately experiencing what is remaining from colonialism. I think it's more obvious to certain types of people than others. It is not something unusual, let us be honest. Every single facet of life depends and is a remnant from what has happened previously. I just think we need to be open. I was talking to Dr. Parvanta before the event, and it's okay to disagree. It's okay to listen to people who are coming from a different experience. Colonialism is powerful. And this power, part of the power is because it's not described properly. Something remains powerful when you cannot see it. It's like a shadow as a child when you are sleeping and you see a shadow. If the light comes on, then you say, oh, it's just a stuffed animal in the background. So that, for me, is the power of colonialism. It is still vague, so it was important for me to try and trace some of the threads so it's visible, and hopefully we can stop being scared of confronting the monster.
Thank you. And what did you find most surprising in Isabel's speech?
I mean, I found it most surprising the way Isabel, strung out how we have to make decisions and our role as journalists in neglect, in the way we process news, the way we report news. We need to understand that we will actually be contributing to the neglect we are accusing humanitarians or the government of. So for me, I wanted to ask, you ended with how we can be more responsible as journalists. And so I wanted to ask, is there any role that humanitarians play in helping us journalists extract our responsibility? And I give this example of the governor who stood up. When he stood up, part of why I tweeted about it was that I knew that there was progress and there were solutions happening. The UN spokesperson might have said the crisis was worse, but there were UN agencies that were actually stopping the crisis. And one of the reports I quoted as a response was a collaboration between the UN and journalists to report on solutions. So I wanted to ask you, where do you think humanitarians come in helping us journalists shape our internal struggle of attention and neglect?
What should they do this so that we look at every crisis? Well, it's a difficult question because, of course, humanitarians are humanitarians, but at the same time, they're also lobbyists for their cause. So, and for us as journalists, we have to talk to different sources, trying to understand the reality on the ground. Humanitarians definitely always have a very positive credit because you are humanitarian, so one has a very positive attitude, or I guess you believe what humanitarians say. Much more credible than, let's say, if you're in an autocracy and you talk to a mayor of a town or something. So I think my answer is much more the answer how we look at it. And I mean, you are familiar with this attitude. We look at humanitarians as one crucial source while trying to cover a crisis, having a whole mindset in our mind, which I was trying to portray. And they are a source which is, I think, very credible as long as we understand that they are neutral, as long as you can be neutral, and transparent. And if it comes to the countries, for example, I remember that Médecins Sans Frontières had an expertise on Libya and how migrants and refugees were being treated in Libya and about those closed camps, and that caused only a little public attention, and that was that was a pity. It also comes, of course, together with sometimes there are good times for news and sometimes there are bad times for news. So right now, actually today I was supposed to be in Lesbos. So I was treating Ärzte ohne Grenzen because I was saying I will talk at the airport and then have a live blah, blah, blah. And in the end, after what had happened at the weekend, we had to be very realistic and say you will not get into the news with your Lesbos story as long as the situation is the way it is. Now you can say, and you have a good right to criticize this, and you have you are obliged almost to give solutions. But I'm at least trying to describe reality honestly the way it is. And we have factors that kick out Lesbos the very moment such a thing as Hamas and Palestine and Israel is taking place, as we witness it. So that's my wig-wag, how do you say?
No, I mean, I think that's a great summary of the challenges that journalists face, and as you say, the sort of the reality on the ground. And humanitarians, I think, often find it difficult that they are one source for journalists, and journalists are going to other sources as well. I'm here with two journalists on stage, so I'm always conscious of time, that sort of they're meeting deadlines. But I wonder if I can sort of beg your sort of patience and just see if we could just take one or two questions before we break for coffee. Yes, in the third row, and then back on the. I think you're about fifth row back, yeah? If we take those two. Oh, we've got one.
Okay. Thank you. Just a question specifically for Ruona. In your excellent presentation, you had a very interesting sort of, perhaps quite minor point around thematic specific journalism, and actually that being, in your perspective, maybe part of the problem that we're talking about. Thinking about the UK media landscape, obviously, and humanitarian responses, that's really relevant because, a lot of the international development coverage is done by The Guardian, that's supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The New Humanitarian, very influential, also specific to humanitarian action. I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit on that and whether you about this point about thematic, specific journalism being a problem rather than the solution. Thanks.
Could we have a brief expansion just because of the time?
I know. Apologies for going over.
No, we started late.
That's a good question. So the problem with thematic funding is that it doesn't matter what else is going on in the world, the news organization feels obliged to tick those boxes. And when you juxtapose it with the fact that newsrooms are less staffed, journalists are burning out, there's more pressure. When you give somebody money and you say you should cover these topics, it means it doesn't matter what is happening. Keep speaking about this, keep speaking the big English about these sets of people. My problem always remains that such strict funding does not actually align with the unpredictability of the news cycle, with the unpredictability of crisis, and with the unpredictability of the newsroom reality. And I think donors are going to have to find a better, more responsive way, because then it appears to the audience that these journalists in this media house on this desk don't care. They are busy reporting all this, but hey, they signed a contract. And so for me, that's where themes can be quite powerful. The last thing I will say is, it might not be obvious, but when you sign on sometimes, journalists and newsrooms also even have to sign to the frequency and publication dates on these themes. So it doesn't matter what's happening elsewhere. They have to meet a deadline. That's the problem.
Thank you, Ruona. And the second question towards the back?
So I need to turn it on? Oh, it's already on. Okay. I have also a question for Ruona. You mentioned a lot about decolonization, and I'm wondering from your viewpoint, is there any future of complete decolonization in the humanitarian work, or do you see any potential risk or even threats of neocolonization in the humanitarian operation today?
There's no threat, right? If I didn't believe there was hope, if I didn't believe things could change, I would even get on that long and very delayed train into Berlin. I do believe, some people got up and for some centuries decided we're going to colonize everything and everybody, even human beings and resources, right? It can end. We just need the will. We need to be vulnerable enough to have the uncomfortable conversations that lead to equitable actions. We just need to start. Can we have a fully decolonized system? Hell yeah, we can.
Thank you very much. I'm conscious that we're way past the hour, and this is a conversation that needs to continue. I think it's been a real privilege to listen to both Isabel and Ruona today to lay out really set the tone, I think, for this conference, the out of sight, out of mind, to have so expertly thought about the issues and in such a short time told us about this. What I think is remarkable is that both of them had a particular theme. Isabel talked about the contagion of hope. Ruona said, we're not here for the doom. And I think that's something that we should take away from this keynote for all the problems and the challenges that have been outlined so clearly, that this should be a positive start to the conference to see what it is that we can achieve. The next thing is, of course, achieving coffee, which is out of this room. And then after that, in this room, there is a session at 11:30 on shaping the decade ahead, interconnections of tension and humanitarian principles. And then in the other room, in the salon, there's another key session that I would point you to, from Ebola to tuberculosis, understanding deadening neglect in mental health. And before we go, I just invite you to thank our two speakers again for their thoughts today. Thank you so much.